Welcome to AP Biology. This video is on plant reproduction. Plants evolved from a group of green algae called Charophyceans. The derived character that makes plants different than green algae is going to be the fact that they can survive on land, that they live on land. The first group of plants to live on land were called Bryophytes. An example of a bryophyte is a moss. The next derived character to evolve in plants was the evolution of vascular tissue, xylem and phloem, that will be used to transport water and sugars throughout the plants. Pteridophytes are plants that have vascular tissue. An example of a pteridophyte is a fern. Although bryophytes and ferns both live up on land, they are both still reliant on the water for reproduction. Both groups of plants produce flagellated sperm that need to swim from the male plant to the female plant, and they therefore rely on water. The first plants to be completely non-reliant on water are the seed plants. Here you see the two major groups of seed plants, Gymnosperms and Angiosperms. They differ in their reproductive structure. Gymnosperms reproduce using cones, and angiosperms have the flower as their reproductive structure. Two important things evolved in these seed plants. Number one, we have the seed, which is going to carry the embryo for the next generation. And two, we have pollen. Pollen is going to be a structure that contains sperm inside of it. That pollen can be transferred using different means, but the important thing is that the sperm do not have to swim through the water. In gymnosperms, such as a pine tree, they rely on wind to transfer the pollen from the male plant to the female plant. Angiosperms that use flowers have an advantage. They don't rely solely on wind. They also rely on insects and other animals. Insects like bees are going to be responsible for transferring the pollen from a male flower to a female flower. This video concentrates mostly on angiosperms. A unique characteristic that plants contain is alternation of generations. Each generation of a plant is going to alternate between being haploid and diploid. Both generation is its own organism. The haploid generation is called the Gametophyte Generation. And you can see here that they actually have a multicellular haploid gametophyte organism. Since this organism is already haploid, it can produce gametes through the process of mitosis. It'll produce sperm and egg. The sperm will fertilize the egg and create a diploid zygote. The diploid zygote is the beginning of the next generation. It's the diploid generation, which we call the sporophyte. Through mitosis, the zygote is going to grow into a multicellular diploid sporophyte, which is a completely separate organism. This sporophyte is going to go through the process of meiosis. Meiosis cuts the chromosome number in half, and it creates haploid spores. These haploid spores can then grow through mitosis into the next generation, which would be a gametophyte. The important thing to understand here is that both generations are separate organisms. You have a haploid gametophyte organism, and we have a diploid sporophyte organism. In most plants, the sporophyte generation is the conspicuous generation. It's the generation that we think of when we think of that plant, and it's the generation that we typically see in nature. The only example would be the bryophytes like mosses. When you see moss outside, you're actually looking at the gametophyte generation. Here we see the flower. which is going to be the reproductive structure of an angiosperm. We're going to look at flower structure. Remember that angiosperms have an advantage over gymnosperms in terms of transferring the pollen from the male reproductive structure to the female reproductive structure. Angiosperms are going to utilize insects and animals to transfer the pollen instead of just using wind to transfer the pollen like you see in gymnosperms. Here you see a picture of a flower. These are sepals, or the leaves underneath the flower. The petals are brightly colored. Brightly colored petals are going to be used to attract pollinators like bees over to the flower. If you look at this flower, the male reproductive structure is called the stamen. The stamen contains an anther and it contains a filament. The anther is the structure responsible for the production of pollen, and that pollen grain is going to contain sperm inside of it. The female reproductive structure is called the carpel, also called the pistil, and it has three parts. It has a stigma on top, which is sticky. It has a style, which is a tube that extends down, and it has an ovary. Inside the ovary, we will find the ovule, and the ovule is going to contain eggs inside of it. Some flowers are called complete flowers. To be a complete flower means that you have both male and female reproductive structures. These flowers are also called perfect flowers. Some flowers don't have both male and female reproductive structures. They have either or, and we call those imperfect flowers. Two types of pollination can take place. You can have self-pollination or you can have cross-pollination. Self-pollination will take place if the pollen is transferred from the anther to the stigma of the same flower. It's going to provide an advantage because the plant can still reproduce if there aren't other plants around. However, it's not going to increase genetic variation. Cross-pollination takes place when pollen is transferred from one plant to another plant, and that's going to be advantageous because it's going to increase the genetic variation. The role of pollinators, like honeybees, is to allow for this cross-pollination to take place. Many flowers will produce a sugary substance called nectar, and the job of that nectar is to attract these pollinators, to attract hummingbirds, to attract bees over to the flower in order for this cross-pollination to take place. Overall, what's going to happen is that the sperm inside the pollen is going to be transferred to the egg within the ovule. When the sperm inside the pollen fertilizes the egg inside the ovule itself is going to become a seed, and that seed is going to hold the embryo inside. The ovary around the seed is going to become a fruit, and that fruit is used to disperse the seed, to get the seed away from the plant and over to the ground so that it can grow into a new plant. This is actually a very advantageous system. Fruit contains a lot of sugar, and an animal is going to come over and consume the fruit and consume the seeds within. When they go to the bathroom, they are going to excrete the seed, and that seed is going to be located in a pile of fertilizer, which is going to help that plant to then grow. Here you see a picture of some hummingbirds and some honeybees and bats working as pollinators. Here we see the process by which fertilization actually takes place. An event takes place called double fertilization. Fertilization occurs when two sperm fertilize two eggs within the plant. Let's see how it happens. The pollen grain is transferred over to the stigma. The stigma is sticky so that the pollen grain adheres to it. Once the pollen grain adheres, a pollen tube is going to grow down the style of the pistil, and it's going to enter the ovary. This pollen grain is going to contain 2 sperm, and both of those sperm swim down the pollen tube, enter the ovary, and go inside the ovule. If you look inside this ovule here, there are many eggs. One of those eggs is going to be extremely large and has 2 nuclei inside of it. We call them polar nuclei. When one sperm fertilizes this egg, it goes from being diploid to triploid. This triploid cell becomes what we call the endosperm, and the endosperm is going to function as food for the developing embryo within the seed. The other sperm is going to fertilize another egg, and it's going to become a zygote. That zygote is going to grow and develop into the embryo, and that embryo is going to feed off of the endosperm. The ovule becomes the seed. The ovary around it becomes the fruit. And again, that fruit is used to disperse the seed. In terms of alternation of generations, the flower itself and the male and female reproductive structures are both sporophyte. Inside the pollen grain, we would find the male gametophyte, which is what's responsible for producing the sperm. Inside the female ovule, we find the female gametophyte, which is what's responsible for creating the eggs. When that seed germinates, germination is a fancy word for going through mitosis or cell division. As that seed grows into a plant, the first thing that it's going to create is a seed leaf. Angiosperms are classified depending upon whether or not they create 1 or 2 seed leaves. These seed leaves are called cotyledons. Plants that produce 1 cotyledon are called monocots. Mono for 1, cot for cotyledon. Plants that produce 2 cotyledons are called dicots. Monocots and dicots have different structures. Some examples of monocots are plants like orchids, palms, lilies, and grasses. If you look at them, the veins in the leaves usually run parallel. You usually see vascular bundles very complexly arranged. These vascular bundles are going to contain xylem and phloem. They're going to have a fibrous root, not very strong. You notice that these plants are not very structural. They're not very tall. They're not able to withstand high winds. They have fibrous root systems. And their floral parts usually exist in multiples of 3. Some examples of dicots are going to be roses, beans, sunflowers, oaks. All the large trees that you see that flower, those are usually dicots. Their veins are usually net-like, right? This is a leaf from a maple tree, which is an example of a dicot. Their vascular bundles are arranged in a ring, and they have a taproot. That taproot is a really strong structural root that's going to anchor the plant into the ground and allow it to grow taller and withstand winds. Their floral parts exist usually in multiples of 4 or 5. This concludes our lesson on plant reproduction.